geez.
Here they come. Wow.
You know, many times when there's been a webinar, we can't see how many people are actually coming onto it, but this participant number is rising and it's at 250 right now for me.
Right.
It must be a different system or something.
With Zoom, we know, I mean, it's a standard Zoom, but we have a large contract. We have a max of 1,000. So
Oh,
that may be part of the package that we have.
and what happens if they're more than 1,000? What do they do?
No room in the inn.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I'm gonna start with my announcements and then hand it over to Julie. Welcome everybody. My name is Rachel Hasna and I'm with the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry Division for Community Behavioral Health. Welcome to our law and mental health didactic. A couple of announcements about the CEU process. In the last 5 minutes of the lecture, we will submit a link into the chat. Click the link, copy and paste it into your browser, finish the evaluation. A certificate of completion is automatically generated for you. It is your responsibility to save a copy of that certificate. So if you're on your smartphone, you'll want to take a screenshot. And if you're on your computer, you'll want to save it as a Word doc or a PDF. If you're joining us by phone, you can email me and we will send you the link to the evaluation. We do not have a PowerPoint for this lecture. It will be an interview format, but we are recording and we will have the recording link available for folks following today's lecture. So, and if you have any questions, you can submit them in the Q&A and I will hand it over to Julie.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome everyone to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series. This series is hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're so glad to have you all here to join us today. My name is Julie Bravko. I'm an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. So first, I want to announce that we are accepting applications for our forensic doctoral fellowship. We have 2 spots available for the 2021-2022 year. Our brochure is ready to go and applications are due on January 14th. Please email me if you'd like a copy. Next, I want to remind you all to join us next week. At that time, Casey LeDuc is going to be presenting neuropsychological considerations in forensic practice. So I want to let you all know that we are going to do things a little bit differently today. So instead of a planned presentation, we're actually going to do this more as a question-answer interview session with Dr. Loftus. So for the first part of today, Dr. Loftus will be interviewed by Dr. Youngren, and then we're going to open this up to questions from all of you. So as usual, please ask your questions in the Q&A, but I do want to warn you ahead of time that we're likely not going to get to all of your questions today. So please forgive us ahead of time for that. Also, for those of you who are on a tight schedule but still need your CEUs, I will let you know when the hour has passed. We likely will be staying on longer to try to get to as many questions as possible, but to qualify for those CEUs, you only need to stay for the hour. So now it's time for what we've all been waiting for. I'd like to introduce to you our speakers for today, Elizabeth Loftus and Jeffrey Youngren. Dr. Youngren is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and a distinguished member of the National Academy of Practice. He's a clinical and forensic psychologist as well. He's also a clinical professor at the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Dr. Youngren has extensive forensic experience in trauma, child abuse, memory, delayed recall, post-traumatic stress disorder, military court specialty, military forensic psychology, general forensic issues, and general court martial issues. He earned his clinical psychology Ph.D. from the University of Arizona. He is an incredible cook, and he's also one of my favorite humans on this planet. Dr. Loftus is a distinguished professor at the University of California, Irvine. She holds faculty positions in the Department of Psychological Science, the Department of Criminology, Law and Society, and the School of Law. She received her Ph.D. in psychology from Stanford University. And since then, she's published over 20 books and over 600 scientific articles. Dr. Loftus's research has focused on the malleability of human memory. She's been recognized for her research with 7 honorary doctorates and election to numerous prestigious societies, including the National Academy of Sciences. She's past president of the Association for Psychological Science, the Western Psychological Association, and the American Psychology Law Society. Her memory research has led to her being called as an expert witness or consultant in hundreds of cases. Some of the more well-known cases include the McMartin preschool molestation case, the Hillside Strangler, the trial of the officers accused in the Rodney King beating, the Menendez brothers, the Bosnian war trials, the Oklahoma bombing case, and litigation involving Michael Jackson, Martha Stewart, Scooter Libby, Oliver North, Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, and the Duke University lacrosse players. With all of her expertise and incredible background, she's also a very kind and humble person, and it's been wonderful getting to know her. Dr. Youngren and Dr. Loftus, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and New Mexico's Behavioral Health Services Division, I'd like to welcome you and thank you so much for presenting today. We're so grateful for your time and expertise, and now I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julie. Appreciate that very much.
Yes.
Lots of nice things. I marvel at the fact that no one ever checks those bios to see if all that stuff is true. I change those bios all the time, but anyway, we just see what happens. I want to kind of begin by saying that about 25 years ago, I became involved in forensic cases, and at that time Beth was at the University of Washington, and on a whim, I sent her an email saying, hello, we have common interests. It's a pleasure to say hello to you. And from that serendipitous email, we have worked together on many, many cases for 25 years. We've developed a friendship and a mutual respect. So not only am I really flattered, and the University of New Mexico flattered to have Beth here, but I'm flattered to have her as a friend and have immense respect for her. So personally, Beth, Garnet and I really very much appreciate you taking the time to do this and in this unusual format.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and my pleasure. Good to see you.
Oh, it's good. So let's start by talking a little bit about the background of your work and some of the findings that you have generally applied to the courtroom and to the criminal justice system, because really you came from a research perspective, but truly you operate now as very much an applied psychologist, providing services to the judicial system. So catch us up to speed on how that happened and how the road brought you there.
So I have to take you way back. I was wanting to do memory research and wanting to do something that had some practical applicability, and began to design experiments on eyewitness testimony. It was a couple of years after I was out of graduate school and on my own in my beginning of my academic career, and I started to do something that memory scientists weren't doing, which is to show people films of crimes and accidents and to study their memories for those very richly detailed events. And I thought I was just doing basic scientific work on eyewitness testimony. At some point, I wanted to get involved in an actual court case and see actual witnesses. So I volunteered my services for free to a trial attorney with the public defender's office. I said, I'll consult on a case for free if I can kind of hang out with you and watch the interrogation of actual witnesses and what goes on in an actual case. And that happened to be a murder case where a woman was accused of murdering her boyfriend. Her defense was self-defense, and she ended up being acquitted. I wrote an article about the case, the science that was relevant to the case at that time, published it in Psychology Today magazine, which I don't know if you remember, but back in the 70s was extremely popular, had a circulation of maybe 1 million. A lot of lawyers read that magazine. And that's when I started getting calls from lawyers saying, you know, would you help me on my case? Would you lecture about this to my group of attorneys? And that was how I ended up getting involved with the legal profession. Kind of serendipitous.
Yeah. Now your earliest research was on the misinformation effect, right? Am I correct on that? Could you share with us a little bit of what that early work showed you?
Sure. When I decided I wanted to study eyewitness memory, I had to decide, well, what aspect of it did I want to look at? Did I want to look at the effects of stress, or did I want to look at the effects of the passage of time? I made the decision that I wanted to look at the questioning process, how the questioning of witnesses might influence what it is they told you. And I did some early experiments where I showed that leading questions could affect what people said. You ask a question like, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? And people said the cars were going faster than if you asked a more neutral question, like how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? And I soon came to the discovery that what these questions are doing is they're supplying information, new information during the process of questioning that can contaminate or transform someone's memory. And it was not the only way you could contaminate memory. You could contaminate it by letting a witness talk to another witness, or letting a witness be exposed to misleading media coverage. All of these provide an opportunity for new information, sometimes misleading information, to contaminate memory. And that phenomenon became known as the misinformation effect.
Okay, so that's like post-event information then, right?
Yes.
I mean, they're providing post information that may or may not be relevant.
Yeah, well, usually it's post-event information that's misleading in some way, can have a negative effect on somebody's memory. That's the phenomenon. And out in the real world, this kind of thing happens all the time.
Right. So that leads us into the world of false memories. Can you talk a little bit about that journey into the false memories and what your research has shown?
Sure. So the early work on the misinformation effect, I and many other scientists as well showed that it was pretty easy to change someone's memory, excuse me, for the details of an event that somebody had actually seen. You could pretty easily make people think that the car went through a stop sign instead of a yield sign, or that the perpetrator who stole the wallet was wearing a brown jacket instead of a green jacket. But at some point when I, excuse me, began to see some of these cases where people were coming up with incredibly bizarre memories, like they were remembering being forced into satanic rituals by supposedly their parents who were part of a satanic cult, and they were forced to sacrifice animals and all kinds of other, extreme stuff. I wanted to see whether you could go further with people. Could you create entirely false memories into the minds of ordinary people And how would that happen and what would that look like? And we designed a method for doing that. We planted some, what we now call rich false memories. That you were, when you were 5 years old, you were lost in a shopping mall. You were frightened, you were crying, you were ultimately rescued and reunited with your family. And we were able to plant this completely made up memory into the minds of ordinary, otherwise healthy adults. And that was the beginning. And now we're up to the mid-90s of what would be a string of experiments showing that you could plant these very rich false memories.
Do false memories differ from real memories? What's the difference between, or is there a difference between an implanted memory versus a memory that actually is based on an event?
That's certainly a question that we and others have been trying to answer. We have done studies that look at the emotionality of these false memories. Maybe people who develop false memories are not as emotional about these experiences as people who truly had an upsetting or traumatic experience. And what that work shows is that people can be just as emotional, just as aroused by their false memories as other people that were truly traumatized are about their experiences. You know, one of the most beautiful demonstrations of this is some work by Richard McNally, a clinical psychologist, professor at Harvard, who looked at the physiological arousal of people who were believing and remembering that they had been abducted by aliens, something that most people think are probably false memories. I don't know how they feel about that in New Mexico, but at least in Massachusetts, most people kind of, except the ones who have these memories, think that probably they're false. But these abductees are highly aroused when they think about their abduction experiences. Heart rate, skin resistance, the typical physiological measures. And we at the University of California have also shown that when you plant a false memory in the minds of people, they can be highly emotional when they are self-reporting their emotionality about the memory.
Yeah, one of the books that I always have liked was McNally's Remembering Trauma book that he wrote about 15 years ago. Is a wonderful book about.
That's a fabulous book.
I frequently had told him he should revise it, and he frequently says no. So,
well, I know revising a book is not exactly usually the most rewarding thing to do.
I guess not. One of the arguments that I have run into frequently in dealing with memory is an argument that, well, you can train people or teach people memories that don't have any significant value, but you could never make someone agree to doing something or implanting a memory of something that was not in their best interest. That would be actually damaging to them. That it's fine to teach something about a mousetrap snapping your finger, or you know, that's the clown did this, the clown did that, or you were even lost in the mall, but not really big, traumatic, emotionally loaded, negative kinds of things. What do you have to say about that?
Well, there are a couple of parts to your question, you know, and so I'll give a little longish answer because it deserves that. After we did the Lost in the Mall study, people criticized it because it wasn't upsetting enough, arousing enough. But other people came along and then planted these rich false memories of things that would have been really upsetting had they happened, like you were attacked by a vicious animal, or you had a serious indoor or outdoor accident, or in another study out of the University of Tennessee that you nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard, succeeding with a significant minority or even more of their research subjects. As for your question about being able to plant something that might go against your self-interest, I would point to some work, a Canadian study by Sean Porter, published a few years ago in Psychological Science, high impact, prestigious journal. They planted a false memory that when you were a teenager, you committed a crime, and the crime was serious enough that the police actually came to investigate. And when they published their article, they reported that 70% of their sample developed all or part of this rich false memory that would have been kind of against your own self-interest. And even the memory scientists were pretty shocked at the high rate of success that these Canadian investigators had, and they acquired the data from the Canadian scientists. They reanalyzed their data using a more conservative coding strategy to decide, is this really a false memory? And with the even more conservative coding strategy, they still report that 30 to 35% or so of that sample appears to have really developed a rich false memory of something that would go against their self-interest. So I think 30 or 35% is pretty impressive.
Didn't that study also talk a little bit about the memories, the false memories lacked a little detail differences, or am I getting that mixed up?
Well, I don't remember specifically, because that particular study was published about 5 years ago now.
Yeah.
But I do believe that, many of the people in describing the memory that they now had as a result of these suggestive interviews and other suggestive influences, they produced details that would go way beyond anything that was used to plant the memory in the first place. And that's the kind of thing we observed in the original Lost in the Mall study. They'll tell you things that weren't part of the initial effort to get the memory going in the first place, telling you what the person looked like who rescued them, or that they remember hearing their name mentioned over a loudspeaker. Just what looks like a lot of detail that can persuade other people who are listening to this report to believe that it's authentic, because we're impressed with detail.
Right. I remember the first case that we did together was the Akiki case in California. And in that case, there were a lot of therapists involved in treating preschool kids that were alleged to be trauma victims. And can you briefly talk about the danger that a therapist can play in these kinds of cases? Because that case, he was acquitted. I believe he was innocent, but we had a large group of preschool kids who had said that he had sexually molested them and driven them places when he couldn't drive. He was actually physically disabled, but they were in therapy. Can you comment a little bit about the dangers, the costs and benefits, I'll use those terms, of therapy in these kinds of cases?
Well, sure. Akiki was San Diego's little McMartin case. After the McMartin case in Manhattan Beach, California, where these preschool little kids were accusing all the owners and teachers and of all these horrific abuses, it certainly appears as if those stories were drummed up by some combination of worried parents and highly questionable techniques being used by the people who interviewed those young children. And in fact, there was a study out of Texas that looked at some of the techniques that were being used with those McMartin kids, like, other kids have said this, why don't you be smart like these other kids, or offering them rewards in terms of, candy or food of some sort. And all kinds of other questionable tactics. And the Texas study found this was a really easy way to plant false ideas into the minds of these young children. I did consult on that case back in the 80s, and that's kind of, I think, why I was also brought into the Akiki case that involved young children. And a few of the studies that I have done over these many decades do involve children of that age group, but typically I am working with other scientists who study and specialize in that age group. I don't have, in my laboratory situation, a way of studying 3 and 4-year-olds. So, but when I eventually got into these adult situations where these grown-up people were claiming that they had recovered repressed memories of things that happened to them when they were children, I mean, I thought that was even more remarkable. It's one thing to do this to a 3 and 4-year-old, and it's pretty easy to do. And quite another thing to do this with a 35-year-old who is a seemingly, you know, functioning adult.
Yeah. So just to chase that a little bit, so for the therapists that are attending, I mean, therapists need to be careful, I'm assuming, to not be advocates for an outcome based upon their own bias in a matter, because one might argue that a therapist themselves might contribute to the development of a false belief. What do you have to say about that?
Oh, yeah. Well, once in the 90s, I started to get involved in these repressed memory cases. And it was then, you know, that I was able to see therapy records, mental health records, therapist notes, depositions of therapists where they had to answer questions about their procedures, that you could see some of the problematic things that were happening in the cases that made their way into the courtroom. And admittedly, I'm seeing a subset of all cases. I'm seeing the cases that are being litigated, that are being contested. So maybe I'm seeing, the worst of it, but it's a lot of it. And what therapists were doing is telling people things like, well, 80% of people with your symptoms, depression and eating disorder, were sexually abused as a child. I wonder if something like that happened to you. And even if the patient denied any sexual abuse, the therapist went on to educate the patient that maybe they have repressed memories, and that those repressed memories need to come out in order to heal the patient of their depression or their eating disorder or their anxiety or their low self-esteem or whatever it is their problem is. Well, how suggestive is that, to be telling them that a massive repression is a real phenomenon, and that they can, only get better if they recover these recalcitrant trauma memories. And they were engaging in all kinds of activities to try to dig those memories out, those allegedly buried trauma memories. And in the process, they were creating rich memories in the minds of some of their patients.
So that kind of led into what is framed as the memory wars a little bit, right?
Well, the memory wars, I mean, things got nasty when people developed these, full-blown, what they thought were recovered repressed memories. They sued their parents, their other relatives, their former neighbors, whoever. The memory wars then entered a new phase as hundreds and hundreds of patients who had been led to believe and remember these things, started to realize their memories were false. That's an interesting phenomenon as a memory scientist. How does that happen? And many of them, scores, maybe hundreds, then sued their former therapists for planting false memories. And those were straightforward medical malpractice cases. And there were lots and lots of those cases particularly in the mid 1990s. And then I don't know if you remember a case that really caught the attention of the mental health field was the Ramona case.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, where Gary Ramona, the winery executive, thought he had a wonderful life, vice president, making $400,000 a year, thought he had a wonderful, fantastic family. His world came crashing down when his daughter, Holly, goes into therapy. Interestingly, she was a sophomore at the University of California, Irvine, where I teach now. And she, in that therapy, discovered that her father had raped her between the ages of 5 and 16, forced her to have sex with the family dog, this prolonged traumatization. She sued her father. And what made this case so interesting and so important to the mental health field is Gary Ramona filed a separate lawsuit suing the therapist for planting false memories in the mind of his daughter, who still believed in those memories. And he was awarded $500,000 from a jury in Napa, California. So in other words, he got this third party standing. He wasn't the patient, but he was able to get standing to file this lawsuit, and then he succeeded with the lawsuit. Fantastic book written about this case called Spectral Evidence, which covers the whole, a journalist wrote it, covers the whole case, the science. She sat through the trial. It's really quite an interesting read.
My understanding is I actually followed that case and trained with one of the psychiatrists involved in that case, that one of the defendants that went before they found them negligent, and an interesting argument, as you say, that they never treated the father. The allegation was that, as you say, he got standing because he was damaged by the conduct of the therapist in implanting the memory in Holly Ramona. As I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, Beth, she still believes this, though. Is that not correct?
I believe she still believes it. And there's another interesting story there. The daughter, about the daughter. At some point, I was, sitting in my office, and I get a phone call, which is not all that different from phone calls I often get. A very distraught mother. She says, my daughter's accusing my husband and me of abuse. I'm so upset this didn't happen. I don't know what to do. She found my name in kind of social media or whatever. And, I talked with her and tried to, tell her where she could go for information or get advice or get a feel for what she needed. And then I asked her, I said, do you know who your daughter's therapist is? Because I thought maybe it would be one of these people who is kind of known to be a big promoter of some of these ideas and teaching them and stuff. She said she didn't know, but soon thereafter, she called me up again. She said, I found out the name of my daughter's therapist. I said, well, what's the name? She said, it's Holly Ramona.
Wow. Yeah, amazing tale. And I don't want to forget to ask you about one of the earlier cases that you did, which is the Franklin case that kind of got you involved.
Well, sure. That's how I got involved in it in the first place. I mean, prior to 1990, when I was working on the misinformation effect, and testifying in court cases, it was primarily, murder cases or armed robbery cases, or, every now and then there'd be a child abuse case, but mostly these other kinds of cases. And, the people I was tangling with might be prosecutors or, police investigators who might be asking leading questions or running biased lineups that I would be criticizing. But then suddenly I get a call from a lawyer, Doug Horngrad is his name. He said, I'm a former public defender, and I've got a very difficult case. And of course, former public defender meant to me that he had a lot of trial experience. He said it was on his own. He'd handled a lot of murder cases, but never one like this. He was representing a man named George Franklin, accused of murdering a little girl 20 years earlier. And the only evidence was the testimony from his daughter, Eileen Franklin, who said that when she was 8 years old, she witnessed her father commit the murder. She repressed her memory, and now the memory was back. And based on nothing other than this claim of repressed memory that had returned, and of course, the testimony of a psychiatrist who bolstered the story and claimed she believed the story was real, George Franklin was convicted of murder, making him virtually the first American citizen to be convicted of murder based on nothing other than a claim of repressed memory that returned. And I thought, wow, this was a surprise, but that was then just the beginning. Of course, people aren't coming up with murder memories. It happens occasionally, rarely, but occasionally. But they did start to come up with all kinds of claims of repressed memory, allegedly all this trauma buried into the unconscious, completely unaware of it until typically this psychotherapy lifted the veil of repression and the patient got to be aware of it. And lots of court cases followed. But the Franklin case was the one that drew me into this whole area, got me reading all of the books and articles being published on this topic, got me convinced that there was not really credible scientific support for this claim of massive repression. And, you know, bringing up Richard McNally and his wonderful book, what he referred to in that book as the repression folklore.
Yeah, I want to, you know, this is not stuff that we prepared, but we've had some wonderful talks about the role of bias in impacting the way people view things. And Randy Otto gave a wonderful talk here about bias. And so therapists need to be careful of the introduction of their own bias into the dynamics of the relationship. What words would you have? You're not a therapist, but to therapists who work in these highly litigious, you know, highly dangerous kinds of areas of professional practice that are loaded with emotion.
Well, I certainly have seen bias, again, in the subset of cases that I tend to get involved in, which would be the ones that are mired in litigation. I mean, one of the places where I have seen bias is in sexualized dream interpretation, for example. I mean, I've seen cases where the patient dreams about a snake and the therapist says that's a penis, and starts to get the patient to talk about the penis, or all right, maybe I could kind of see that. But in one case that I worked on in the state of Washington, when I was still living up in Washington, the patient dreamt about a cinnamon roll, and the therapist told the patient that was a penis. And I thought to myself, I don't get that one. That one, I don't, maybe the snake, I don't know about the cinnamon roll. But of course, in the trial, you have cross-examination, and this therapist could be queried. Now, why is it that when your patient told you she dreamt about a cinnamon roll, you told her that was a penis, and the therapist said, well, it's because of the goo on the top of the cinnamon roll. That's how the therapist knew. Well, how is that for an example of bias in interpreting what the patient is saying and then feeding back a potentially highly biased interpretation that leads that patient down a dangerous road?
Yeah, I think that bias both in the clinical setting and forensic. I mean, obviously forensic psychologists have their own biases as well, but it's risky stuff. So let's talk a little bit about the reality that you spend by far the majority of your cases are defense cases. Why?
Well, first of all, in the criminal cases, yes, that is true. It's usually the prosecution that has somebody who's uttering a memory report. The defense is doubting that report or wanting to question that report. And it's usually the defense that then wants to bring in the memory science to educate the jury and respond to that memory report. In the civil area, things are a little more complicated. Yes, when somebody is suing someone, and it could be either in a criminal context or a civil context, typically this memory science gets introduced by the defense. But of course, when I have worked on cases involving the retractors, and there, again, I've had scores of those cases, there I'm testifying on behalf of the plaintiff about how the particular set of suggestive influences impinged upon this plaintiff, who is now retracting the accusation, and could have been responsible for leading this patient to a set of false memories.
Okay, you recently did the Weinstein case in the face of multiple allegations from fairly prestigious, well-known women. You were retained by the defense. Why did you take that on?
Well, I'll tell you, that was a really hard case for me, Jeff, because 2 years earlier, I had been contacted by a lawyer in California who was representing Mr. Weinstein, and she was representing him in conjunction with some potential accusations in California. I started to look into those cases, and of course, over the next 2 years, there were more and more stories about him. And the New York litigation then came to fruition, and he was now going to be prosecuted in New York. And I do have to say that I was feeling a little uncomfortable about this, and because I was getting seduced by the media, and my discomfort, I think, contributed to my recommending another expert for them. And I recommended another expert who I thought she's a collaborator of mine. She's excellent. And she not only had expertise in memory, but she had other expertise that would have been useful to the defense. She had she'd done a lot of work on sexual consent, sexual communications, and so on. So they hired my collaborator, and I thought, okay, I guess I'm off the hook for having to deal with this case. But then Mr. Weinstein, on advice from Alan Dershowitz, I think, said, you really should have Loftus in this case. And so they come back to me, we want you too. And I'm thinking to myself, I thought I solved this problem, but why am I resisting? I'm resisting because I've been seduced by the media coverage, and I've been telling people for years, don't let this happen. I'm resisting because I fear that I'm going to face difficulties. It's going to be harder for me to successfully, help other people that I might want to help. And I thought, if I bow out for those selfish reasons, wrong reasons, I'm going to feel like a coward. And so I went ahead and went to New York and testified just about memory science, not a mention of any specific people in the case, didn't even review police reports in that case. It was just general memory testimony. And even with that, and even with my strong belief that we have a system where we are proud of the fact that no matter how unpopular you are, you deserve a defense. That's our democratic and criminal justice system.
Yeah.
I still got a whole lot of flack.
I'm sure you did.
I did.
Less than fun. So here's a open-ended question. Are the memory wars over?
Sadly, I don't think they're over. Just a few years ago, in a project headed by one of my former graduate students, it was a massive survey about the beliefs and about memory and repressed memory and trauma memories. Massive survey, and it showed it involved memory researchers, clinical psychologists of all types, clinical researchers who work on university campuses and so on. And what this showed is there's still a great big gap in the beliefs of professionals about this topic, where you get some groups of psychotherapists still thinking massive repression is common and is supported, and huge numbers of memory scientists or clinical psychologists who work in a university setting saying they don't believe it. And so the title of this paper, actually, and there's a link to it on my UC Irvine website in case anybody wants to read it, is Are the Memory Wars Over? And the answer is basically no.
It's been going on for years. I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, but you actually needed a bodyguard once at a talk because people were so angry at you for not validating repressed memories. Is that not correct?
Well, yeah, that happened in when I published a book in the mid-90s called The Myth of Repressed Memory, and then was invited to give some talks. I remember being at the University of Michigan. They had to hire a armed police officer to accompany me most of the day. People started threatening organizations that invited me to speak with lawsuits and threats if they didn't cancel my invitation. Never mind the year before, I had published a paper called The Reality of Repressed Memories in the American Psychologist. But so there was a lot of people were kind of upset about this. Then even after this year, after the Weinstein case, I got uninvited to give a big deal lecture at New York University that was all scheduled. The airline tickets had been bought. It was supposed to take place in April of this year. Probably would have been canceled because of COVID, but instead it got canceled basically the day before my Weinstein testimony, after there was publicity about the fact that I would be testifying.
Wow.
Even though no one had any idea then what it was I was going to be saying.
Well, no one can say you're not brave. That's for sure. You just take it on. Really share with us, Beth, where your research is taking you in the future. Where are your interests now at Irvine with your graduate students and those that you've graduated?
Well, we're doing lots of interesting things. Just this week, published a paper on infodemics and the pandemic and misinformation having to do with COVID and having to do with political issues and how it's polarizing society. A beautiful several papers that are a collaboration with some Irish scientists where we're showing that we planted false memories in the minds of voters in an Irish election. And this study basically shows that you can plant fake news in the minds of voters, and that the people who are more willing to accept the fake news are people for whom that fake news fits with their biases, fits with their preconceptions about the world. So these are kind of maybe you could call them motivated false memories, and we're doing some work on that. A lot more studies on the misinformation effect, and just trying to learn a little bit more about it. We got to get these students through the process with their PhDs so they can go on the job market and teaching the next generation.
Any more books in your future?
I do update with collaborators, of course, a book on eyewitness testimony, a Lexis book for mostly for lawyers, how to handle eyewitness and memory issues in all aspects of your cases. But I'm trying to figure out what I want to do next. I'm waiting to be struck with that big idea. And I don't know what it is just yet, but last time I was waiting to be struck, I fell into the memory wars, and that swept me away for decades.
Yeah, I was going to say that's rather absorbed you. Okay, we have tons of questions from people, so get ready. Julie's going to come on, and I'm going to disappear for a while. And don't leave till I come back on, though. Okay, and I want to, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and your friend here, I want to thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, Jeff, we didn't even get into how we actually met. I mean, but we'll have to do that next time.
We'll do that another time.
We'll do that another time.
Yeah. All right. Julie, you're on.
Thanks, Jeff. Bev, that just means you need to come to New Mexico after COVID restrictions are.
Yes, I want to come back to New Mexico because the few times I've been there before. Long
That's right.
now.
So we have lots of questions. I'm going to try my best to get through as many as possible. So the first one is, using the Weinstein case as an example, how can jurors understand general framework testimony and how it applies or does not apply to the specific case?
Well, that is an interesting question, because you can say something like people can be exposed to post-event suggestion and it can contaminate memory, but how do you know whether it happened in any particular case? I mean, all I can say is that when I get involved in these cases, I'm looking for changes in testimony. When somebody goes from saying, "Oh no, I had a wonderful childhood. I love this, I love my family members." And then somehow later is, "No, I was raped for 11 years and forced to have sex with a family dog." What went on in between? And if there's a lot of suggestion, I think it's possible that people in general, jurors in particular, might at least consider the possibility that suggestion is what produced the change in the memory report. In the Weinstein case, of course, they ended up convicting him on some counts and not on others. So that jury did make some distinctions.
Thank you. The next question. 30 years ago, mental health professionals and the public all knew that memories were like detailed videos and could be repressed and recovered. How far have we come in the public education effort to undo these misconceptions?
Well, of course, there was definitely a common belief back then, but sadly, it's still a common belief, even if fewer people hold it, that memory works like some kind of recording device, particularly for a traumatic experience. You register it and it leaves some kind of indelible imprint. The researchers in this area disagree with that model and talk more about the constructive or reconstructive nature of memory. I mean, I like to think of memory more like a Wikipedia page. This metaphor will go out the window soon, maybe anyhow, but like a Wikipedia page, you can go in there and edit it, but so can other people. And I think recognizing this truth about the malleable nature of memory is something we should embrace, so that we make good decisions about important events and not ones that are based on outdated or misleading views about memory.
Next question is, what is your opinion on the books True Stories of False Memories and The Courage to Heal?
Well, of course, The Courage to Heal. I'm not sure what True Stories of, I'm not sure which one that was, but let me speak about The Courage to Heal. Back in the beginning, in the 90s, when these cases were starting to flourish, and then the memory wars and so on. The Courage to Heal as a book got identified as one of the most widely read treatises in the incest book industry. USA Today, I think, published the sales figures for a whole bunch of self-help books at the time. And I think at that time it had sold, 750,000 copies, or maybe more than 1 million. It's in multiple editions. The problem with the book, even though it's a book that could bring comfort to genuine survivors of abuse, you're sharing your experiences and realizing you're not alone. And that obviously is very comforting to genuine victims. But the problem with the book is it had suggestions in it, like even if you don't remember your abuse, but you've got these symptoms, then you were probably abused. It had, in one edition, the names of lawyers who would help you bring lawsuits. And so it was considered a contribution to the disastrous memory wars, a major contribution. And then I'm not sure what True Stories of False Memories there is actually referring to. There are lots of other books that are relevant, and maybe that's a book about false memories and that have developed in the minds of people. And there have been a number of those that have been published.
Next question is, has your work examined the phenomenon of negative stereotype induction with adults? And if so, can you point us to a paper on the topic?
I'm not sure what negative stereotype induction is. That sounds like a term from social psychology, and I'm a cognitive psychologist. So I think if you pose that to a social psychologist, because they study stereotypes all the time, but maybe it refers to negative feelings about a group of people. But we know that negative stereotypes exist, and all the work on the implicit association test, the IAT, is an attempt to dig out those stereotypes in people who might not be aware that they have them.
How would you suggest, or do you have suggestions regarding helping people who have had false memories implanted by others?
Yeah, of course it happens because these retractors, the ones who have been through this process, have accused their family members, have ruined the family relations, and then come to realize their memories are false. They're very troubled. They're very guilty about what they've done to their family members, and they could use some really good, healthy psychotherapy to help them work through these feelings. And I think it behooves everyone to recognize that symptoms, even a collection of symptoms like depression, anxiety, eating disorder, whatever, low self-esteem, they can arise from a whole lot of different causes. And the problem that's existed is that some subset of therapists seem to have in mind one and only one idea, that childhood sexual trauma is the cause of every problem. And I think we need to move away from that and embrace the idea that there are lots of other causes. And so maybe these newer follow-up therapists can help these patients explore what might have been responsible, what other alternative explanations are there for your depression, your anxiety, your eating disorder, your other problems in life.
So this person has two questions. First is, how do you prevent the research from being legally misused to exonerate those who are guilty? And the other question from this individual is, are there ethical concerns regarding planting false information in research subjects, and has the nature of your research changed as a result of greater awareness of these kinds of ethical concerns?
I'll start with the second one, Julie. First of all, these experiments on memory distortion and on the planting of rich false memories have now been going on for 4 decades. In many different countries, in many different research labs. And so many different human subjects review committees or ethics committees on colleges and university campuses or medical schools have approved these procedures, and we follow the required procedures of our committee. You have informed consent, you have debriefing. To my knowledge, there's never been an adverse effect of somebody being in these studies, despite 4 decades of research on this subject in so many different locations. No, I think if anything, people have just gotten more and more creative and have been able to do things that you know, sometimes I marvel at the fact that the Human Subjects Committee was willing to allow a proposal to go forward. Right now, we are looking at, well, I've published 1 paper with collaborators, and I have another one, you know, that I'm trying to get published. We'll say it's between rejections, but we'll get that published eventually. That look at where are people after the debriefing? Do they harbor any of these misleading ideas still, even though they've gone through the whole process of the experiment and been debriefed? And basically, what these studies collectively show is that there might be a little bit and piece of fiction still floating around in the mind of a research subject, even though they've been debriefed. But there are also benefits that accrue through having gone through this process. They get more interested in this topic of memory, maybe a little more knowledgeable about memory science, and in one of the studies, a little more resistant to a further attempt to mislead them. So I see some benefits from having been through these kinds of experiments. Now, the other part of the other question, separate question, was what do we do about guilty people glomming onto these ideas and using them to deny acts that they are actually guilty of? That, of course, can happen because guilty people deny their guilt all the time. And, you know, I'm not sure, you know, what we can do about it. We're not going to be able to eliminate that altogether, but maybe we can figure out ways of analyzing those situations and helping a jury come to a better decision when they're facing a situation where a guilty person is using the false memory work to deny their guilt.
Thank you. Next is, can you comment upon the recent resurgence of repressed memory in EMDR, the body keeps the score, etc.? It maybe seems like this concept is kind of making a comeback.
Well, in fact, we're just publishing a little paper on EMDR right now. So I happen to have been thinking about that. You know, clearly this is a treatment that appears to have some success in helping patients deal with their traumatic experiences and get better or feel better after the treatment. I happen to believe that the active ingredient in the EMDR is the habituation. I don't even know that you need these eye movements at all, but that's for another set of researchers to look at. But certainly, you know, habituation and just reviewing traumatic experiences can sometimes loosen the grip that the experience has on your emotional reaction. A question has arisen in recent times whether these eye movements affect the likelihood of developing false memories. Because in some of these situations, there has been a claim that false memories have been developed through this EMDR process. There's a lot of mixed research, with some studies showing that just the eye movement component did not increase the rate of false memories. A study out of the Netherlands showed that it did increase the rate of false memories. We've reviewed this small body of literature and come to the conclusion that the eye movements alone don't have any particular effect on false memories. Excuse me.
So there are a number of questions that are basically getting at, are there ever repressed memories that are actually true or that actually happened? And are there ways to figure that out?
Sorry, so are there memories that are true in what? In the
repressed memories that are actually true or actually happened? And are there ways to figure out if something actually happened or didn't happen?
Well, first of all, I should make this very, very clear. People can have a bad experience and not think about it for a long time and be reminded of it. Retrieval cues can remind you of an experience that you had in the past that you haven't thought about in a long time. That is ordinary forgetting and remembering. You just have to go to a high school reunion. You can experience that for yourself. But what is being claimed in these cases is too extreme to be explained by ordinary forgetting and remembering. And of course, when people went to the state legislatures and to try to get the statute of limitations told for these claims of repressed memory, they argued to the legislatures that something unusual is happening in these cases. It was like the delayed discovery doctrine, and we had to toll the statute of limitations. And so it's that phenomenon, that this massive repression, something too extreme to be explained by ordinary forgetting and remembering, that I and others have argued there really isn't good, credible scientific support for it. So yeah, if you have I didn't think about it for a long time and I remembered it, that might be a real experience. But I would then ask you, why is our legal system set up like this? If somebody goes into a police station and says, police, officer, I was robbed 20 years ago. Somebody took $100 from me at gunpoint, and I just remembered the experience, and I want that person prosecuted, and I want my $100 back. And the officer says, well, what is it? What do you mean you just remembered? Well, I floated up to the ceiling and I looked down and I saw myself being robbed. The officer is not going to say, okay, we're prosecuting. The officer is going to say, floated up to the ceiling, look down, I think we need to commit this person. But when somebody goes in and says, I just remember I was abused 20 years ago and I want him prosecuted. How did you remember? I floated up to the ceiling. I looked down, I saw myself being abused. They say, okay, that's dissociation, and they embrace it. Well, why?
Are there certain traits or variables that predict who would be more susceptible to having a false memory?
The studies have looked at individual differences. With most of the individual difference variables that have been looked at, you can find a statistically significant correlation. So for example, if people are somewhat low in standard tests of intelligence, they're a little more susceptible to memory contamination. If they're an especially cooperative person and they're low in cognitive ability, that's a little bit of a deadly combination. Yeah, the correlations are often never any larger than about 0.3 or 0.35. So they can be statistically significant, especially when you have large numbers of subjects in a study. They're not overwhelming. But I do have to point out that we've got cases in our immediate past in society where extremely intelligent, educated, experienced adults have developed pretty rich false memories, things that turn out to be completely false. So certainly being above average in intelligence, experience, and education didn't help Hillary Clinton from developing a false memory that she landed in Bosnia under sniper fire, or the NBC nightly news anchor Brian Williams from falsely remembering that his helicopter had been attacked by a missile. These are just some examples of how really smart, educated, experienced people have had a problem with memory.
For those of you that are still on, just to let you know, we are past the hour. So if you need your CEUs, there's a link in the chat. Click on that, fill that out, take a screenshot, print it, save it. We don't send copies. We are going to continue with questions, but for those of you that need to jump off, you're welcome to do so. So the next question is, do you think that children lie about being sexually abused with any regularity? And if so, is there research that suggests that it's common?
Well, young children do lie. And two psychologists, Steve Ceci from Cornell, Maggie Brock, whose last academic position was at Johns Hopkins, have written some beautiful articles about all the different ways and reasons that children lie. And, I think they do end up creating false stories about sexual abuse. We certainly have hundreds, if not thousands, of examples in these totally discredited daycare cases, like McMartin or Kelly Michaels, or the one that Dr. Youngren, where Jeff mentioned, the Akiki case. But there, I don't know whether, they are necessarily deliberately lying, or they've been just led to believe that these things happen through highly suggestive interrogations and other procedures. How often it happens, there's no way I can know that. It certainly does seem to happen more often, arising in vicious disputed custody cases than cases that don't have that aspect to them.
Next individual says there's been research largely out of the UK in which individuals with ID have been found to be more susceptible to suggestion and tend to shift or change their responses to legal questioning depending upon the way the question's phrased and on feedback from the questioner about their initial response. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I'm not sure I know exactly which study is being referred to, but that's one way you get people to change their story, is you give them certain kinds of feedback, or you reward them, or you give them other kinds of information. And that's what this large body of work on memory contamination is all about. You can do it with young children. It's young children ages 3 to 6. It's even easier than with older children and adults.
Is it difficult to remove the planted memory that we have put in someone's mind?
Yeah, all of this research actually involves planting a memory and then attempting to remove it through the debriefing process. And until recently, people didn't know much about where a subject was after debriefing. We never saw the subject after the debriefing. The experiment's over, the subject's gone off, and you don't see the person or talk to them or know what they're thinking until these recent couple of studies that I alluded to in answer to an earlier question, where we now have a little bit of an idea that they might have some inklings or about the false experience, still left, but they also have experienced benefits from this. You know, out there in the real world, it'd be interesting to maybe study the retractors a little bit more. They have been studied because here are people who developed the memories. They now are convinced they're false. Some of them can still kind of see images, even if they are deciding these images don't reflect authentic memories. I think they're a worthy group of further investigation.
So there are a couple of people have asked about dissociative identity disorder and recovered memories. So some people want to know if you think DID is real. And then others have asked if you see any connection between recovered memory and DID.
Well, you know, the way the question is always asked is, do you think DID is real? I mean, I think I'd like to see that question worded a little differently. These patients are behaving in a real way. I mean, they're behaving and exhibiting the symptoms that we classify as DID. The real question is, how did they get that way? Did they get that way because of some severe childhood trauma, or did they get that way through iatrogenic influences, through the influence of psychotherapeutic intervention or other forms of suggestion that maybe don't come from a mental health intervention, but there's plenty of suggestion out there in the community. And that is where the dispute is. And again, because I see DID cases or former DID cases that made their way into litigation, I'm seeing this subset of heavily disputed cases that where there was a finding that it was a iatrogenic generation. And that's why there was a very large jury award or financial settlement on behalf of the retractor who has retracted those accusations and that diagnosis.
Thank you. Next, we have someone that wants to know if there's a false memory susceptibility quotient that can be tested, identified, and potentially meet Frye or Daubert.
I don't know of any quotient, no.
Okay. Are there any studies comparing fMRI results from implanted memories versus spontaneous memories?
There are a few fMRI studies that have looked at individuals who are recounting true memories versus false memories. I conducted one of them with 2 investigators who are specialists in fMRI. It basically shows that, I mean, the overwhelming result is the similarity in the neural signals when people are recounting a true memory versus a false memory. A false memory that they believe is true. So we are a long, long way away from being able to use neural signals as a way of differentiating whether somebody is telling you a true story or a false one that they believe is true.
This next individual says, as a defense attorney, I often run into issues with the classic in-court identification, which I believe essentially distills all the worst aspects of a suggestive identification and memory tampering in cases where the defendant was not previously known to the witness. Sometimes there was already a suggestive identification procedure prior to the court hearing. Do you have any thoughts on this less publicized, but I believe much more pervasive issue?
Oh, I think this is an exceedingly important problem in the criminal justice world. You get people going to some identification test. It might be looking at a lineup or it might be a 6-pack. They might make an identification, even a little tentatively. In one case I worked on, the genuine rape victim said this one looks the closest. But by the time the trial takes place, many of these victims are absolutely confident, and they express that confidence in the courtroom. They might even be kind of coached in their trial prep by the prosecutor or someone who says you want to express confidence, essentially, and they do. And we know that jurors are responding to that level of confidence. So you have this artificially inflated confidence, either through coaching or sometimes just supplying feedback to the victim. Yeah, that's good job. You picked our suspect. That too will artificially inflate the confidence. And then you end up with a defense attorney's nightmare. What do you do with a genuine victim who's expressing all his confidence? And you might be inhibited from aggressive cross-examination because they are an actual victim, even if their identification might be mistaken. And some recent work out of Duke University, just published by Brandon Garrett, shows that, you know, even when these jurors are reminded that, you know, in the past, the confidence was a lot less, they're still impressed with that in-court confident identification. I think we do need to remind them that the confidence was a lot less. Maybe that we need to educate them how confidence can go from kind of low, weakish to high and strong, and to figure out some ways of alerting the jury to the fact that a high confident in-court identification can be misleading to a jury. You know, there are people who are recommending that in-court high confident identification should be banned. I don't know that that's ever going to happen, but it's being suggested by some people who are advocating this reform.
This next person wants to know if recall consistency or repetition of the memory can be taken as evidence of its authenticity.
Well, I'm not sure. It depends on when the repetition, I guess, happens. So I can give you a situation where you might want to take it as an indication, and another situation where you might not. So you know, if the person right from the beginning, off the bat, their very first attempt to report what it is they saw, tells you what they saw with high confidence in a pristine questioning situation, like unbiased interrogation, unbiased photographs or whatever, and then they persist and tell the same story, you know, maybe you want to believe in that story, certainly more than this other situation where maybe she goes to the lineup, she gives a tentative identification. I think that one's the closest. She's told, good job, that's our suspect. Her confidence is inflated. And now she says, I'm absolutely sure that's the guy. Well, she can say it 10 more times. And I'm not gonna think, oh my God, that 10 more times, that's awfully consistent. I want to know what happened the first time. And why is that one different? So you've got to look at that whole picture.
Are there any findings in your early research on memory that has not held up under the scrutiny of your own or others' research, leading to changes in your opinions?
Well, back in the 80s, when I was arguing that memory can be transformed by post-event information, and you can now remember something that is different from the way things actually were. And we were arguing about what happened to the original memory. What happened to that original memory? And I was arguing that it was transformed or altered. And the only way you get back to the original memory is you need a realteration to get back to that original truth. there was a lot of subsequent work. We were duking this out in the pages of the Journal of Experimental Psychology. And I ultimately did come to the opinion that there are many routes to getting to a wrong answer, to giving a false report. Sometimes there's a memory alteration, but not always. Sometimes you never really even saw the original detail in the first place, but you just accept the suggestive information and adopt it as your own. There's no memory alteration in that example. And other times you remember your original thought, but now somebody else comes along and says it happened differently, and you recognize the conflict, you think about it back and forth, and you decide, I think I'll trust this other person and resolve my discrepancy in favor of the other person's memory. Those are three different ways in which someone can come to a false memory. And that was certainly a change for me based on much more additional science and theorizing that went on in the field.
Can you discuss cases where there is factual evidence that someone was molested? For example, medical records, physical examinations, etc. And the patient reports not remembering the incident or recalls them only during the course of taking a social history or psychotherapy.
Well, you know what you're making me think of is the study by Linda Meyer Williams. Linda Meyer Williams had records of people in the 1970s who were, where there was a report of molestation. Because there was a study going on in this city, happened to be Philadelphia, urban Philadelphia, where any report ended up, that came to the police station or came to a hospital, ended up being recorded. So 20 years or so later, maybe an average of 17 years, so she goes back and interviews these now adults, because they were children then under the age of 12, but now they're adults, about their childhood. And some 38% of them don't remember the incident, that the medical reported incident of abuse that got them in the records. So, you can ask, well, why don't they remember? Well, some of them were really young at the time of the experience, some under the age of 3. You might not remember that because of childhood amnesia. Some of them might not have wanted to tell the interviewer about the experience. Maybe they didn't feel comfortable doing so. Some of them had what you might call maybe a relatively milder kind of abuse, a kind of a touching or a fondling. And later in their life, they may have had more severe traumas happen to them. And so they might have even talked about the severe traumas, but this one in the record was not as important to them as some of the other traumas that they ultimately disclosed. So there's certainly the way you ask the question or how you prompt for the information can affect what people will tell you. But some of these people might then later, if you remind them, which she didn't do, of the record and what the story was in the record, you might have gotten people say, oh yeah, now I do remember. But I might call that ordinary forgetting and remembering. And you don't need this special, mystical, massive repression to understand that phenomenon.
All right, so we're at 26 minutes after 1. I think we should probably wrap up for today, but before we do, any final words?
No, I think if I wanted to leave the audience where I gave a TED talk with the one take-home message that from 4 decades of working on these problems, and I guess it would be that just because someone tells you something and they, with a lot of detail, a lot of confidence, even expresses emotion when they tell you it doesn't mean it really happened. You need independent corroboration to know whether you're reliably, whether you're dealing with an authentic experience or one that's a product of some other process.
Well, we really want to thank you, Beth, for taking the time to do this. I know that we imposed on you and it's a hard time, but these talks, and Julie and Rachel and Anthony and the team kind of have caught fire. We had 700 people on your talk. So
Wow.
and
are they from all over the place, or do you know where they're from?
all over the United States, all over the United States. So, and lots of positive things. So personally, I appreciate it. I want you to know that. And we'll likely see you in the holidays. So.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, it'd be nice to get the questions. If you can capture those questions, because I see there are many more questions than Julie was able to get through.
There were.
I can just see what's on people's minds.
Yeah. Well, can we get those? We can, can't we, Julie, copy them, or Rachel?
Rachel.
Sure, I'll figure it out. Yeah, I'm sure we can.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Beth, very much.
Okay, great.
Thank
Be
you.
safe.
Nice to see you all.
Nice to see you too. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone, and we'll see you all next week. Bye.
Thanks for your services, Ephraim. Have a great holiday. Thanks, everybody.
You as well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.